She crossed her arms, staring coldly at the grease-stained mechanic beneath her car hood. She saw only the broken father they discarded 8 winters ago. She never realized his scarred hands rested directly on his salvation. Will a stolen decade finally find its justice? The road, winding through the heart of New England, was entirely unforgiving, when winter truly took hold. A heavy, gray blizzard had swept over the ridge, much earlier than the radio had predicted, turning the twilight into a blinding sheet of white. Evelyn gripped the steering wheel of her vintage red sports car, her knuckles white as the tires fought for traction against the rapidly accumulating snow. Then, without warning, the engine gave a violent, metallic shudder and died completely. The sudden silence inside the cabin was deafening, broken only by the furious howling of the wind outside. At 60 years old, for a lifetime spent commanding respect in perfectly heated courtrooms, Evelyn was not a woman who panicked easily. Yet, as the bitter cold began to seep through the glass, she realized the gravity of her situation. She stepped out into the freezing storm, her boots sinking deep into the drifts, looking for any sign of shelter. Through the swirling snow, a lone, flickering light caught her eye at the edge of the woods. It belonged to an isolated, weathered garage, its tin roof rattling under the force of the gale. When Evelyn pushed a heavy wooden door, the scent of motor oil and old iron offered a brief reprieve from the freezing air. The atmosphere inside was instantly suffocating. A man in oil-stained brown work overalls stood up from a workbench, wiping his hands on a rag. As the dim fluorescent light buzzed overhead, illuminating his face, Evelyn froze. The years had added lines to his face and a profound tiredness to his eyes, but she knew exactly who he was. 8 winters ago, she had sat on the high judicial bench, looking down at this very man. His name was Sam. He was the young man she had coldly handed a maximum prison sentence for his alleged role in a major auto theft ring. She vividly remembered the way he had begged her for leniency, pleading for just 1 week to see his dying mother. Evelyn, proud of her reputation for unyielding, textbook justice, had denied the request. His mother had passed away alone, while Sam was behind bars. An unbearable silence stretched between them, thick with the unsaid grievances of the past. Sam recognized her immediately. The slight tightening of his jaw gave it away. Yet he did not scream or rage. Instead, he maintained a rigid, submissive posture, the defensive stance of a man who had been thoroughly crushed by the weight of the legal system. He merely looked at her with a hollow, deeply wounded gaze and asked, in a flat, measured voice, if he could help. Evelyn felt an uncomfortable knot form in her throat. For the first time in her life, her absolute certainty in her own flawless record felt strangely heavy. Before she could answer, the garage doors rattled as a large official vehicle pulled into the driveway outside. Chloe, Evelyn's 35-year-old daughter, stepped into the workshop, stomping the snow from her boots. As a sharp, ambitious deputy prosecutor, Chloe practically exuded the arrogant authority of the town's legal elite. She informed her mother that the main highway had just been completely blocked by a snowdrift, making it impossible to leave the mountain. Then, Chloe turned her cold, analytical gaze toward Sam, her eyes immediately scanning his faded uniform and the older scars on his hands. Oh. Why are you letting a man like this touch your vehicle, Mother? Chloe asked, her voice dripping with absolute disdain, entirely unbothered by the fact that Sam was standing right in front of them. People of his background don't change. A thief is always a thief. Sam did not defend himself. He simply walked over to the vintage red car, popped the latches, and lifted the heavy hood. Chloe walked over, stepping into the light, and stood directly beside the engine bay. She crossed her arms tightly over her sharp, dark blue business suit, looking down at Sam with a piercing expression of utter suspicion. As Sam leaned deep into the engine compartment, his fingers working methodically through the frozen wires, Chloe continued to throw sharp, condescending remarks, warning her mother to watch her belongings, and mocking the idea of rehabilitation for habitual criminals. Sam endured the humiliation in absolute silence. though the muscles in his neck were rigid with suppressed emotion. Evelyn stood a few paces back, watching the scene unfold. She looked at her daughter's haughty, unyielding expression, and for the first time, it felt like looking into a mirror of her own past self. The sight made her deeply uneasy. She chose to remain silent, neither defending Sam nor agreeing with her daughter, adopting her old role as a detached observer. But internally, first cracks were beginning to form in her lifelong armor of pride. The storm outside seemed to mirror the tension within the walls, as a sudden, violent flash of lightning illuminated the frosted windows, followed instantly by a thunderclap that shook the entire structure. From a small, cluttered side room at the back of the workshop, a sudden, terrified scream pierced through the noise of the thunder. It was a high-pitched, frantic crying that signaled a child in absolute panic. The moment the sound hit the air, Sam's submissive demeanor vanished. He dropped his wrench, his face turning pale with pure fear, ran toward the back room without a word to either woman. Driven by a strange, quiet impulse, Evelyn moved away from her daughter and followed his footsteps across the cold concrete floor. She stopped just outside the heavy, weathered door frame, peering through a narrow crack in the opening. Inside the dim room, the man her courtroom had branded an unreformable, heartless criminal was on his knees on the floor. He was weeping silently, his large hands impossibly gentle, as he wrapped his arms around his small son, who was shaking violently from the noise of the storm. Sam Ken cradled the boy's head against his chest, rocking him back and forth, whispering soothing words into his hair as the thunder continued to rumble heavily outside, leaving Evelyn frozen in the darkness of the corridor, utterly shattered by what she was witnessing. The trembling of Evelyn's breath was the only sound she made as she stepped back into the shadows of the narrow corridor. Her heart hammered against her ribs, a strange, uncomfortable ache settling deep in her chest. For 30 years on the bench, she had prided herself on being an infallible judge of character. She had categorized the world neatly into upstanding citizens and unreformable criminals, the image she had just witnessed through the crack in the weathered door. A supposedly heartless felon, weeping quietly, while gently rocking his terrified, autistic son through the thunderstorm, refused to fit into any of her rigid legal boxes. It was a profound, undeniable display of pure parental devotion, retreating to the main garage bay. Evelyn wrapped her coat tighter around herself, suddenly feeling much colder than the New England winter warranted. The foundation of her lifelong certainty had developed a hairline fracture. 10 minutes later, Sam emerged from the back room. He did not look at her, his posture hunched and exhausted, as he quietly rolled his creeper back beneath the red Mustang. The wind outside continued to batter the tin roof, creating a suffocating, elated vacuum within the damp cinderblock walls. Evelyn stood near the workbench, pretending to examine a row of rusted tools, but her mind raced. How could she have been so entirely wrong about a man's soul? And the heavy silence was suddenly shattered by a sharp scrape of metal from under the car, followed by a harsh, ragged intake of breath. Sam slid out from beneath the chassis far too quickly. His previous submissive, beaded demeanor was completely gone. In its place was a rigid, trembling tension. He stood up, his face pale, pointing a grease-stained finger toward the undercarriage of the classic car. "Did you know about this?" His voice shook, no longer carrying the quiet deference of a former inmate, but the sharp edge of an accusation. "Know about what?" Evelyn asked, startled by his sudden shift. "The VIN," Sam demanded, stepping closer. "The serial numbers on the exhaust frame. They've been ground off." Meticulously, Evelyn's legal instincts instantly flared. She moved to the side of the car, crouching down as Sam directed a harsh flashlight beam onto the metal. There it was. The identifying numbers hadn't just been scratched, they had been acid-washed and buffed using a highly specific, professional technique. It was a method designed to make stolen parts completely untraceable. The cold dread washed over her. It was the exact signature methodology used by the massive auto theft ring she had presided over 8 years ago. Her defense mechanisms triggered immediately. She stood up, her posture stiffening into the commanding presence of a judge. "This vehicle belonged to my late husband," she stated firmly, trying to mask her rising panic with authority. "Are you implying something, Sam? Or is this just a technique you are still entirely too familiar with?" It was a cruel thing to say, a desperate attempt to protect her own flawless worldview by pushing the blame back onto the convict. Sam stared at her. The accusation hung in the freezing air. But this time, it did not break him. Instead, it ignited a fire that had been buried under 8 years of unjust suffering. "I didn't steal a single car in my entire life, Your Honor," he spat, the formal title sounding like a curse. His chest heaved as he closed the distance between them. "I was a mechanic. I fixed things. That was all I ever did." The prosecution had irrefutable evidence, Evelyn countered, though her voice lacked its usual iron conviction. "Financial records, witness testimonies. You signed the confession yourself, signed a piece of paper to keep my 18-year-old brother from dying in a maximum security prison," Sam shouted, his voice cracking with the sheer force of his suppressed agony. "He was a stupid kid who got mixed up with the wrong crowd. They told me if I didn't take the plea deal, if I didn't take the fall as the ringleader, the brother would be tried as an adult and sent a place where he wouldn't last a month." Evelyn felt the floor tilt beneath her feet. No prosecutor would agree to such an illicit arrangement. The police report was airtight. The local authorities built that case from the ground up. And who do you think handed them that airtight case? Sam's voice broke, tears of pure, undiluted frustration finally spilling over his weathered cheeks. "Do you think threatened my family? Who do you think needed a convenient scapegoat to protect the actual people running the operation?" Evelyn's mind raced frantically through the past. The case had been neatly packaged. The evidence had been gathered swiftly, almost too perfectly, handed directly to her courtroom by the one man she trusted implicitly. The man who had assured her that putting this young mechanic away was a victory for the town. "You," Evelyn whispered, her voice barely audible as the last pillars of her pride collapsed entirely. "Who forced you to confess?" Sam wiped his eyes with the back of his oil-stained hand. He picked up his heavy metal wrench and hurled it violently onto the concrete floor. The deafening clang echoed through the cramped garage, like the strike of a judge's gavel. "Your best friend," Sam said bitterly, his gaze locking onto her shattered expression. "Sheriff Hank." The echo of the sheriff's name seemed to suck whatever remaining warmth was left from the damp garage. Evelyn stood entirely motionless, the heavy syllables ringing in her ears like a death knell. Hank, her oldest colleague, the man who had sat at her dining table for Thanksgiving dinners, sharing wine and talking passionately about cleaning up the streets. The raging blizzard had finally begun to exhaust itself, easing into a pale, freezing dawn that cast a harsh, gray light through the frosted windows. But inside the shop, Evelyn's entire reality was unraveling at a terrifying speed. The perfectly ordered legal world she had championed for 3 decades suddenly felt like a gruesome, meticulously constructed lie. He looked at Sam, really looked at him. She saw the sunken shoulders, the grease-stained hands trembling against the cold metal of the car frame, profound weariness of a man who had sacrificed his own freedom to save a foolish younger brother, only to be completely crushed by the very system she represented. The suffocating weight of guilt settled over her chest. For 8 years, she had carried the pride of that conviction, never once suspecting she had been the executioner in a corrupt man's game. Before Evelyn could find the words to respond, the harsh, the jarring ring of the wall-mounted landline shattered the silence. Sam flinched as if he had been struck. He stared at the old, yellowed plastic phone hanging near the office door. Slowly, he walked over and lifted the receiver, and watched his knuckles turn white as he pressed it to his ear. "Hello," Sam whispered, his voice incredibly fragile. The garage was so quiet that Evelyn could clearly hear the booming, overly cheerful voice crackling through the earpiece. "Morning, Sam," the hearty voice echoed. Evelyn's stomach plummeted into an icy void. It was Hank, Heard the plows are finally making headway. Heard my old friend. The judge got stranded at your place last night. Her daughter called the station, worried sick. A heavy, not suffocating pause followed. Sam closed his eyes, his breathing turning shallow. You haven't been bothering her with any old ghost stories. Sam, Hank continued, the forced cheerfulness dropping into something sharp and menacing. Because you see, I just got off the phone with the Stat Child Welfare Agency. A concerned citizen reported that a special needs boy is living in a freezing, hazardous auto shop with a convicted felon. They were ready to send a caseworker out this morning to take the boy into emergency custody. Sam let out a choked gasp, his knees buckling slightly. But I told them to hold off, Hank said smoothly. Hold them, I'd check on you personally first. Just to make sure you're still cooperating with your second chance. Fix the car, Sam. Let the nice judge go home, and keep your mouth shut. Or you'll never see that boy again. The line went dead, with a sharp click. Sam didn't hang up. He simply let the receiver slip from his fingers, leaving it to dangle by its coiled cord, a continuous, mocking dial tone humming in the background. He slumped against the cinderblock wall, sliding down until he hit the floor and buried his face in his hands. A raw, agonizing sob tore from his throat. Please, he begged, his voice muffled and completely broken. Leave it alone. I can't lose him. I'll fix your car right now. I won't charge you a dime. Just please, don't do anything. Don't look into it. They'll take him away from me. Evelyn stood frozen, seeing the devastating fallout of systemic cruelty. This was the true face of the justice she had served, a blunt instrument used by predators to hold a father's love hostage. The threat was so cowardly, so utterly depraved, that the paralyzing guilt inside her rapidly crystallized into something else entirely. A fierce, burning indignation began to rise in her chest, chasing away the cold, the rigid, unwavering belief in the rules of law that had defined her entire existence evaporated in that freezing morning air. The law, she realized with bitter clarity, was utterly useless against the men who controlled it. If she wanted to save Sam and his sons, if she wanted to atone for the life she had helped destroy, she could no longer play by the righteous rules she had sworn to uphold. Ellen stepped forward and picked up the dangling phone receiver, placing it firmly back onto the cradle to cut the dial tone. She didn't offer empty words of comfort to the weeping father. Words were useless now. Instead, her eyes hardened into a cold, terrifying calm. Reaching up to her coat lapel, she unpinned the small, gold honorary judge badge she had worn with bravery for years. Without a single moment of hesitation, she dropped it into her deep pocket, ready to begin a much darker, far more ruthless game. The metallic click of the phone receiver, settling into its cradle, felt like the pulling of a trigger. Evelyn did not hesitate. Drawing on 30 years of reading criminals and dissecting lies, she picked up her cell phone and dialed a secure number she hadn't used since her days on the bench. A direct line to a senior investigator with the federal authorities. A woman who owed Evelyn a favor and operated far above the reach of any local sheriff. Once the pieces were quietly set into motion outside the valley, Evelyn made her second call. When Hank answered, Evelyn forced her voice to tremble. She sounded exactly like a proud, desperate woman, watching her pristine legacy crumble. She told him that she had just discovered the scratched serial numbers under her late husband's car. She panicked, begging him to come to the garage immediately, pleading for his help to cover it up before the scandal could destroy her family's reputation. He took the bait without a second thought. The sun fully breached the horizon, casting a harsh, cold light through the frosted windows of the garage. The trap was set. Sam was hidden in the back room with his son, holding his breath in terrified hope. Evelyn stood perfectly still beside the open hood of the red Mustang. The air in the shop was suffocatingly tense, pulled as tight as a piano wire. The heavy garage doors groaned open, in a blast of freezing wind. Hank stepped inside, brushing snow from his heavy coat. He wore his badge prominently, his chest puffed out with the arrogant confidence of a man who believed he owned the entire town. He looked at the vintage car, then at Evelyn, a smug, paternal smile spreading across his face. "I told you to leave this alone, Evelyn," Hanks said, shaking his head with mock sympathy as he walked toward her. "But don't worry, spent my whole career cleaning up messes. We'll get this car crushed, make the paperwork disappear, and your precious reputation won't take a single hit." Evelyn wrapped her arms around herself, projecting perfect vulnerability. "But what about the mechanic?" she asked, her voice tight. "Sam knows what he saw. How can we possibly be sure he won't go to the press? If he talks, the state board will strip my pension," chuckled, a dark, thoroughly ugly sound that echoed off the cinderblock walls. He leaned against the fender of the Mustang, entirely at ease. "He won't say a word. He didn't talk 8 years ago, when I told him to take the fall for his junkie brother, did he? I built that whole theft ring, Evelyn. And when the heat came down, I needed a scapegoat to hand to your courtroom. He squeezed that kid until he broke, and I can squeeze him again now. I own him. He's a nobody." The words hung in the freezing air, a complete, unvarnished confession born purely of ego. Evelyn dropped her arms. The fragile, frightened posture vanished instantly. Her spine straightened, and her eyes turned as cold and sharp as cracked ice. She reached calmly into the engine compartment, right next to the intake manifold, and pulled out a small, digital voice recorder. "You always were too arrogant, Hank," Evelyn said, her voice dropping into the steady, commanding register she had used to sentence hundreds of men. "And you fundamentally misunderstood me. Care about my reputation anymore. I care about the truth." Hank's smug smile collapsed. The blood drained from his face as he stared at the red blinking light in her hand. He took a furious step forward, his hand instinctively reaching toward his duty belt. But he was already entirely too late. The side door of the garage burst open. 4 federal agents stepped into the cold light, their expressions grim and their weapons drawn. A sound. They had been waiting silently outside the perimeter, listening to the live transmission. "Hands where we can see them," the lead agent barked, moving in swiftly. Hank stammered, his eyes darting wildly around the room as the undeniable reality of his downfall set in. The heavy metal handcuffs ratcheted around his wrists with a sharp, definitive click. In mere seconds, the untouchable sheriff was reduced to exactly what he was: a disgraced, humiliated criminal being shoved out the door into the freezing morning air. As the sirens faded down the mountain road, the oppressive, chilling weight that had smothered the garage finally lifted. The storm outside had broken completely, leaving behind a brilliantly clear blue sky. The door to the back room slowly creaked open. Sam stepped out, his hands trembling. He looked at the empty space where his tormentor had just stood, and then he looked at Evelyn. Tears of absolute, overwhelming relief spilled down his face. He didn't have to say a word. Profound gratitude in his exhausted eyes was enough to break Evelyn's heart and heal it all at once. The nightmare was over. He and his son were finally safe. Hours later, the federal authorities had cleared the scene, promising Evelyn that Sam's wrongful conviction would be expedited for a full overturn. The harsh daylight faded into a soft afternoon. Inside the small, cluttered break room at the back of the garage, a warm yellow desk lamp cast a gentle glow over the worn table. Evelyn took off her heavy, structured designer coat, the last remaining armor of her old, rigid life, and draped it over a chair, settling in wearing just a simple sweater. Sam pulled up a stool, setting down 3 chipped porcelain plates. On them were thick slices of a homemade cherry pie he had been saving. His young son sat happily on the floor nearby, and quietly, as he played with a toy truck. Evelyn picked up her fork, looking across the table at the mechanic she had once wronged, now sharing a quiet, ordinary meal in a place that smelled of motor oil and old iron. She took a bite of the sweet, warm pie, feeling a profound, unburdened peace settle deep within her soul. For 30 years, the sharp, authoritative crack of a wooden gavel had echoed constantly in her mind, demanding rigid perfection. But, sitting there in the golden light, surrounded by the quiet grace of forgiveness, the gavel was finally, permanently silent.